handled the 51st state issue. Boom, gone. They did it with a smile on their face, went and had lunch, and it's kind of like, okay, let's get to work.
That is Donald Trump's ambassador to Canada, Pete Huckstra, exactly a week ago on this program, saying the 51st state discussion was over, as you saw, gone. But fast forward to this week. Mr. Trump has brought it back, posting to social media just hours after the king delivered the speech from the throne. I told Canada, which very much wants to be part of our fabulous Golden Dome system, that it will cost $61 billion if they remain a separate but unequal nation. Trump went on to say it will cost $0 if they become our cherished 51st state. They are considering the offer. The Prime Minister's office responded to CTV in a statement saying that the Prime Minister has been clear at every opportunity, including in his conversations with President Trump, that Canada is an independent sovereign nation and it will remain one. The first part of Trump's comments there also bears some political weight, putting a $61 billion price tag on Canada joining the Golden Dome missile defense project. In a keynote speech to a military conference this morning, Defense Minister David McGuinty laid out his plan to get Canada to NATO's current military spending target, 2% of GDP. It's a 5-year plan, but it already might be out of date. NATO appears poised to raise that rate to 5%.
Will you push back against 5%?
I think right now we're moving forward on a 2030 deadline to achieve our 2%, as we've announced. So, like I say, stay tuned.
You're going to push back on 5%?
We'll see how it goes. Take care.
The front bench is back. Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, Carl Belanger, and Stephanie Levitz. Jamie, I'll start with you. Let's start on the Trump comments first, following, just a few hours after the king delivered the speech from the throne, once again invoking the 51st state. What does that say to you?
That he's bored and kind of a one-trick pony and is stuck on this track without any real idea as to where he wants to go, and wanted to find a way to get himself into the king's stories yesterday. I wouldn't ascribe much more strategy to it beyond his own narcissism, to be honest.
And what about the potential consequence on sort of the groundwork laid over the past few weeks, punctuated by the throne speech, that the government says they're going to embark on renegotiating this relationship?
Yeah, I think when it comes to defense policy in Canada, I think there's actually a lot to be debated here. I think there's a broader consensus that we need to spend more. And I also think there's a fairly broad consensus that just spending more is not good enough, and how we do it is actually probably where the debate ought to be. And then when you take the Canada-U.S. relationship to this, there's what's best for Canada's long-term defense policy and how we rebuild our armed forces, both technologically and in recruitment. And then there's also the day-to-day dynamics of negotiating with this man in the White House and how that's going to drive his policy and the broader Canada-U.S. relationship. So let's take the Golden Dome as an example on this, Bashi. Back in the Martin government, it was called Star Wars. This essentially is just the exact same thing with new rebranding. You could argue that it's easier for Canada to nod along saying we're going to do this without actually having to put real money and real commitments on the table, knowing that President Trump is never going to be able to get this through Congress and this actually be a thing, and they'll continue to talk about it. So as they continue to talk about missile defense, Golden Dome, it's kind of like our Ring of Fire. We've been talking about exporting critical minerals from that since the early 2000s, and those are yet all still in rocks in the ground.
Sharon, what's your take on Golden Dome?
Well, it's I feel like we're in a bit of a sci-fi movie of some sort, the way that he talks about it. But when we see that tweet, I think the one thing that I try to remind people that I talk to who kind of get very anxious about the rhetoric that we hear coming out of President Trump is, so he is always going to be a showman. He's always going to be the guy who does reality TV. He might be the president of the United States, but he also is very much into, I don't want to call it trolling, but maybe it is a bit trolling in terms of what he's trying to say or do. So I take the 51st state stuff that he's saying in with a bit of grain of salt in this, because he's just throwing it in there. Now, in terms of the Golden Dome, Prime Minister Carney and the Liberal government, the Liberal platform, I think they made it very clear that they were going to spend more on defense than the previous government did. We saw that with the radar announcement, they said, with the investments looking through the skies, and also in terms of the Arctic. So 5%, we weren't able to get to the 2%. And I know the question is always going to be, can you do more? Can you do more? And can you do more? Right. And the answer should always be yes. We are getting to a point to do more. Are we going to get to a 5%? I find that very difficult and hard to see. Maybe there needs to be a discussion about our limits as well in terms of what we're putting in there. But the message has been strong and clear is that there is going to be more put into defense. What that looks like is different. We're different economies of scale.
Although it takes, like, even this, Carl, 5 years in this plan, 2030, to get to 2%. We're talking right now, 5 years out, the rest of our allies, the Secretary General this week said he expects the new target to be 5%.
Yeah, and it's going to be a nice target that we won't meet.
Like the last one.
Just like the last one. So we can talk about these numbers. I mean, the issue is not how much money you spend. It's how you spend it. Right? Because you can spend money. It's easy to spend money. We're spending money right now to replace the frigates with the Canadian Surface Combatant Program. Billions overpriced, years delayed. To what end? So spending money is not the end. And this is where the government, needs to come with a plan. And they've made some announcement during the campaign, and we'll see how they deliver on that. And if it's effective, if you're getting the tools that our men and women in the armed forces need when they're deployed overseas, instead of going on the black market to buy the newest helmet or the infrared capacity that they need. That's what I'm looking for. Not just spend money, just to target pie in the sky. It doesn't matter.
The interesting part is nobody has really spoken, no politician staff has really spoken about it in the way that Carl has. And there's this intersection in that you may be entirely right that the end is not just spending money, but the discussion around NATO that has been internalized by, in particular, U.S. President Donald Trump is about those targets and spending more. And so there is a distinct pressure on Canada to not kind of, I guess, talk about it in the way the previous government did for a while until the very end.
Yeah, I think that, and you see Mr. Carney sort of trying to do this, right, to reframe Canada's military spending and defense procurement and how we are going to contribute as more of a global thing with allies, with talking about getting out of this free rider idea that Canada is too much of a free rider, because that's something that really irritates the U.S. president, right? This perception that America is always doing everything, and that's partially where this Golden Dome issue comes from, right? Like, America is tired of protecting Canada, tired of paying the bill, and says Canada ought to pay. Canada ought to pay in. With Mr. Carney trying to build these alliances, though, it becomes a bit of a problem. Like, it's one thing to have the U.S. beating on you for your defense spending, but if he's trying to get into this Rearm Europe initiative and he's trying to really reconnect with the Europeans and isn't ponying up more money for defense that's more oriented towards the NATO target, then maybe those allies are going to turn on him, too.
Okay, well, on that note, I will leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Our front bench, Stephanie Levitz, Carl Belanger, Jamie Ellerton, and Sharon Carr.